somewhat happy to see me. In any case, I'm happy to be with you. Not to see you, because I never see you. You are a total mystery to me. But nonetheless, today I'm hoping to teach you about some core concepts in political history. More precisely, I hope to teach you about feudalism. This class is going to explain that concept and give context to both the previous and the next classes. In the church, and I explained a lot about the church, but I didn't explain too much about the state and how it worked in these times, in these medieval times. So that's what we're going to do today. I hope you enjoy the medieval imagery. If you have questions, again, you can interrupt me, and I'll answer them. So we are talking today about the Middle Ages. I think you've all heard of the Middle Ages, right? And you all have an idea of it. Maybe your idea is more based on fantasy, like Lord of the Rings, rather than actual history. But in real history, where there's no dragons, it is based on the period between the end of the West Roman Empire, which means when the power of Rome fell, and either the fall of the Western Roman Empire or discovery of the Americas. Matters on how you count, but they end around the same period. So the Western Roman Empire falls in 476, and then America gets discovered in 1492. Discovered because you already were there, of course, at least part of your ancestors. So there was not really a discovery, it was just a discovery for the European world. But with that, let's say the next colonial phase in world history starts and capitalism starts developing. But we're talking about that 1,000 years in between, that millennia in between the fall of Rome and colonial times. So it starts with the destruction of Rome. Rome was a very big empire, but at the end of the day, it was just one city trying to dominate the world, which has its limits, right? And they did it usually through warfare, which means that they attract a lot of enemies. One of them were the northern tribes of Europe, people who came from France, northern Germany, Belgium, wild men like my ancestors who ran around with just pants and an axe swinging, and my ancestors and other wild crazy people invaded Rome and at some point won and sacked and destroyed it. And after that, well, the whole empire fell. Not the whole empire, but the western side of the empire fell, the one that was based from Rome. And that meant the end of the unification of Europe, because it was unified under Roman rule. You had the same legal code everywhere, etc. But that fell apart because these invaders didn't start a new empire themselves. They just came to smash the empire, but they didn't have any plans of world conquest. There was not one big leader. They were just against Rome. And as they went back home, and everybody returned to their own tribe. And everything fell apart into smaller pieces. And this first period is what we call the Dark Middle Ages. This is the first 400 years, let's say, after the fall of Rome, when there was no central authority, when most people couldn't read, 99% of people could not read or write. So there was not that much culture that we know of, at least. Maybe they had all kind of ritualistic dances and such. And they were not tribal in the savage sense. Well, they were savage, but they were not savages. They did have their own legal systems and technology, and they were not behind Rome in any sense. They were just not centrally organized, and they were less focused on formal culture. So it's called dark because we don't know much from these times, because nothing was written down. It was all oral communication and rituals. So these are the early Middle Ages. And the only thing that we know that did happen, the only records we have are from the church. The church did grow, even without Rome. Well, the might of the Roman Empire, the church did spread. The faith of Jesus Christ, your Savior, did penetrate upwards into Europe. So that happened. And out of this, once this stabilized, grew the feudal society after the year 900. So what is that? Let me explain feudalism first in abstract as a concept, and then I'm going to spend the rest of my lecture explaining the details of this. So to use my own definition, because I like it best, feudalism is not a very contested concept, right? What I'm saying here is a very safe mainstream reading of it. Most people have a very clear understanding of what it is. So I'm first going to read it. Feudalism, I claim, is a hierarchical political system based on leasing land in exchange for services, leading to a fragmented political order with overlapping claims of aristocratic authority. Again, feudalism is a hierarchical political system based on leasing land in exchange for services, leading to a fragmented political order with overlapping claims of aristocratic authority. Let's break that down. So feudalism, right, is a hierarchical political system. That means that society is based in different groups, one more powerful than the other. There's a certain subjection that is part of society. And this inequality, let's call it, this hierarchy, it is based on leasing land in exchange for services. That means that the people on top, they have land and they lease it to other people. Lease means that you rent it or you give it to people to use, right? So you lease the land to farmers who's going to use the land to farm in exchange for services. Those farmers need to work for it. They don't pay you in money, they pay you in work. In most cases in food, like they work the land, they grow stuff on it, they give you part of that. And that's what the power is based on. The power is based on leasing land, and then the people below that might lease that land too, etc. And that leads to a fragmented political order. Why? Because, I'll explain all of this in more detail, but because you have the system of subleasing, right? So you have the king who leases to the counts, and the counts who lease to the knights, and they lease to blah, 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 blah. So you have a lot of landlords to listen to. It's not just the one you're leasing from, because he is also leasing it from someone else, etc. So you have to listen to a lot of people. So there are a lot of claims of overlapping authority in this system. So it's hierarchical, based on leasing, and with a very fragmented political order. Those three components make feudalism. And this is the system that ruled Europe for about 1,000 years, at least. Now you could say that the Roman Empire was also feudal to some extent, whatever. Now what's important here is that I'm not going to talk about any specific country. I'm going to talk about this as if this was in some fantasy land, right? I'm not going to talk about France or England or Spain. I'm going to talk about this in some kind of mystical European country, because the experiences of each country are a little bit different, and I'm going to talk about the average, right? I'm going to talk about, if you take the elements of all these countries together and you look at what they have in common, right? What would the system be? This is what we in sociology call an ideal type. You take the most typical characteristics of a system and you turn that into an example so you can explain something easily, right? So just imagine, I guess I'm talking about France, but I'm also talking about UK and Italy at the same time. Yeah. But it is a system. It's not just the history of one country. One evidence of this is that this exact same system exists in other parts of the world too. I'm just going to talk about Europe. But for example, this also existed in Japan. In Japan, you had the exact same situation. You had the emperor would lend it to the leaders of different clans, and they would lend their land to the shogun, and the shogun would lend to the farmers, etc. it worked the same in Japan as it did in Europe. It was a kind of universal trend at that moment. Yes. So that's what we are going to talk about. So, as a good Marxist, I will start with the economy, right? The basis of the social order. So, in these times, the most important sector in the economy was agriculture. There were not that many cities. There was no such thing as industry. So everything that was made that was not food was made by individuals. So you'd have a smith that would make nails, but you didn't have a nail factory, right? So it was all broken down into small artisans, none of which was particularly important, right? None of whom were rich. By the way, why do we only have 51 people? Where are these 20 missing people? I should scold them more efficiently. Anyway, it was based on agriculture. The most important thing is land, right? People are struggling just to eat. So in the society in which everything is based on farming, the most important economic resource is not money, it is land. Not money, because money was relevant to the king to pay his army, but for most people, land was more important because you could make food from it. So people who had land had power, right? And the people, the normal people, most of them lived in villages. You had some cities, the capital usually, but the average person lived in a very small community that was more or less independent, right? You just had a bunch of farmers, and you had a smith and a baker and I don't know what, priest, and that was kind of your community, right? There was no such thing as urban life, or at least not for most people. So that's your very small scale economy. And out of this economy grew this feudal system. Now I'm going to explain it from both sides. I'm going to explain why from these small communities you ended up with the system. And we're going to explain how the king from his side wanted the system. So we're going to both look at it as a bottom up and a top down idea. So bottom up, why would you get in the system of leasing? Well, because you need protection. You see, back in the time, there were very limited communications and transport capacities. If you were in trouble, you could not call the police. You could not call the king because there's no telephone. The very best thing you could do in the optimal circumstance was to send a pigeon to them. And I don't know why, but in that time pigeons would come more or less magically find out where they had to go. Or more likely you would send a guy on a horse to go get him. But the guy on a horse, he didn't have something like a highway to run over, right? The last real big roads were built by the Romans. But since then, nobody really invested in big roads because you had all these small territories, right? So like France would be something like, I don't know, 60 different little kingdoms and territories. So nobody's gonna, not one of them is gonna invest in making a road all the way through France. So it was kind of hard to move around. So when you were in trouble, even if your messenger would reach the king, now the king had to assemble his army and then get to you, which would take weeks. So the king was useful to protect you against like a full-scale invasion. If 5,000 madmen were coming from another country, yeah, then the king could react to this with his own 5,000 men, and you'd have this big war. But if you were raided by 50 guys, Vikings, for example, who came in a boat, the king could never react fast enough to that. So what you needed as a local farmer to shield you from smaller robbers and thieves was local protection, right? You needed a local militia to protect you. So you needed a lord, some tough guy with muscle to look after you. And so the idea was that you would try to live on the land of some powerful guy, or they would just give the land or take the land from them. And then these powerful people, they would lease that land to you. So they said, okay, you can live, let's say, in the shadow of my castle, sometimes literally, and you can work this land, and in exchange, you have to work for me. So the farmers, they rented the land, not with money, because it was almost no money. They rented it through work. So if the king wanted to expand his castle, you had to go move bricks, right? And you would give him food, etc., etc. Or maybe he wanted you to join his guard, and then your oldest son had to become a soldier or whatever. So you get the land, well, you get to work the land, you get to keep the product. It's not your land, it's his land, and you need to work for them. That's kind of the basic deal in feudalism. So that's why people accepted this system from the bottom up, because out of fear, basically. Now, why did the king want this system, right? Because he's not scared. He lives in the biggest castle. He had all this land, because he was the king, but he couldn't use it. There was no real thing like wage labor back then. So he didn't exploit it like a capitalist would just own it. He couldn't work it, right? The king had it, but he didn't have the manpower to work all this land. And by then this was quite hard. So what he did, and he couldn't oversee it all, and he didn't have the communication to be in charge of everything. So what he did is he delegated the authority. He leased it to slightly less powerful people than himself, called vassals. Vassal is somebody who leases land from the king in exchange for their services. So the king, he just delegated authority downwards so he could keep control, and the people from the bottom up tried to get in the shadow of the castle to protect him. Because it was very hard, brutal times. Yes? So economically, you now create a certain hierarchy, right? In case you didn't understand so far my lecture, I hope this will make it clear, right? So at the top, you have either the king or the emperor or the pope, who on paper owned all the land. So he had a paper that says, I'm the king and I have these and these lands, and etc., etc. Now this king is going to delegate it. He's going to lease this land to his, let's call them tier 1 vassals, which typically would be counts. You have all these names, right? Counts, baron, lords. There's slightly different things, dukes. I think the highest one of them are counts. Counts or dukes. So anyway, your tier 1 vassal, the counts, let's say he has 5 counts, right? That he divides his territory, and then he keeps a 6th one. So there's 6 pieces of the pie. And these counts, they give him money in return, taxes that they levy upon the population, and also troops. They give him the bulk of his army. Now these counts cannot control everything, so they then again delegate this authority to the tier 2 vassals, which would be your lower aristocracy, barons or knights. So these people, imagine if you would stand somewhere and you would look 360 degrees around, right? They would control an area roughly as far as you could see. They would not control things beyond where their castle could see it, because in the middle you'd have your castle. That's more or less it's comparable to like a city, right? Let's say that the counts had something compared to, they were like a governor, and the barons were like a mayor of a space, or knights, etc. And they in turn also give taxes to the counts, so the counts could pay the king, and they would provide troops, or they would be the troops. If in case of knights, they and their family would be professional soldiers. They would fight all day and practice on peasants because their life is worth nothing. Now, these knights, since they were soldiers, didn't work the land, so they would lease it then to what I will easily call big farmers. So these are the people who actually run the farm. They actually are in charge of the farming, but they don't work themselves. They're just they're comparable to your modern CEO, let's say, right? Or manager. So they would own the farm, and they would provide work for the baron to build his castle, for example, and food. that they would grow. And then you would have the people who work the land, right? So the big farmer, then he has people who live on that land. They don't own it, they just live there in a shack or in a tent, and they do the actual work. So they're like a bit like your slave class, although they're not slaves. They could leave. They cannot leave the. They can leave the farm. They cannot leave the baron or the count's land. This kind of limits to how far you could leave. But they don't have to work there if they don't want it. But they usually had to in practice. So these servants, they just survive and pray and are very ignorant until they die. These people definitely could not read, knew nothing about the world. They just knew how to work. So that's your society here, right? Any questions about that before I move on? Are you even alive?
Yes,
Yes,
Yes, very alive.
Okay.
I do have a question.
Good.
I just want to know, like, I don't understand very well what is like what does the king have to gain? I mean, he only gains a little bit, or like, I don't understand that very much.
Well, the king, with the system, you mean, right?
Yes.
Well, it allows the king to control his land without too much work. So he gets to sit on his throne and get all the money, but he doesn't need to do much because all the work is delegated downwards to other people. And thus he can, without too much effort, keep in power. Because he only needs to worry about the people directly below him. And as long as these people don't rebel, as these counts don't rebel against him, he's relatively safe. And in that time, just not having to work was an enormous luxury. Work is really hard. Like you'd be just working 12 hours a day, and then it's night and you can't do nothing because there's no light. So just being freed from that was a big thing. And the king, what he would get from this, he would get money and he would get troops. So he could then fight wars against other kings and expand his territory.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Then let's talk a bit about how this socially worked. So again, you can interrupt me whenever. It's not the longest lecture. So socially, right, feudalism was very different from modern times because nowadays we have something called equality before the law, right? That the law should be the same for Mr. Abel as it is for Andrea. But in that times, you had the opposite. You had inequality before the law. That means that the law was based on different people having different rules. Basically, you have a system of privileges. The people at the bottom with no privilege at all. And then the other tiers, they would gain rights, right? Every step higher you are, the more rights you have and the more exceptions you have to the law. So the people at the top, let's say the counts, they would have vastly different rights than normal people. Some rights being very weird. For example, in some countries, the count had the right to sleep with your wife on wedding day. So you got married, but he got to go first. That's kind of weird stuff. So it's not very common, but in some counties you had that. So, and there had certain things that only they could do, right? So only certain people can have taxes, only certain people can do trade. If you did a craft, let's say you were a butcher, that was also hierarchical. Like you had different tiers of butchers, and only one guy in the city was like the leader butcher, and he could open new slaughterhouses. And you could just work there until you earned your rank. It's a guild system. So anyway, there was a lot of formal inequality. People were not necessarily unequal in money, but they were unequal in their rights because they had different positions. And these positions were hereditary, which means that you would get them by being born in this group. So once you're a knight, your children are also going to be knights. Well, unless they are sissies and don't want to fight. But you would inherit that title from your father. So you were always in the same group, basically, right? They were just separated. And just once you have land, well, that means once the king allows you to have land, the rest of your family is going to have that same land and live in the same castle. And once you're at the bottom, there's no way up. That there is, you can't. Unless you like save the king's life or something, and he makes you a knight. But there's nothing you can do on your own to go upwards or downwards, really. So this inequality was very central to society, and you had different classes. Very simply, you had normal people, priests, and nobility, but we can make it a bit more complex. So at the top, you would have the ruler class, which would be either the king, the pope, or the emperor. Sometimes all three, right? So because so how it practically worked, you had the emperor, you had the Holy Roman Empire, which today you would call Germany, but it was kind of Germany and Italy combined in some, not, this is complex, but just to mention it like that. This was one empire, but it was not like the Roman Empire in the sense that it was not very organized. There was no such thing as Rome in it. But anyway, that had an emperor. Then you had the Pope. The Pope would actually have real power. Like the Pope would have lands and castles, and the church would not just be it was not just the church. The church also had whole cities and provinces and lands that they owned. The Pope was the boss of all of that. And then you had independent kingdoms, such as France, for example. Right, and this would be the leaders. Then below them, the more practical leaders was your higher aristocracy, right? These are your lords and your bishops and your counts and your dukes. And below them you had today you call it maybe middle class, like the people that didn't really work with their hands, but they weren't that rich either. So you had your lower nobility, your barons, your knights, you had monks, people who live in abbeys, big farmers, etc. And then below them, you had the people. You had the remaining 90% of society, which are called serfs. So what's a serf? Let's talk a bit. Serf comes from servitude. So a serf is a bit like a slave, except that they're nobody's property. But they are doomed to work though. So serfs are people who don't have anything, but don't have land, and they work on someone else's land, right? So in exchange to live there, basically, to have a space in society, physical space, they just have to work on the big farmer's land, and they serve their local lord. So they have to do whatever the people above them say. So if the Lord says, hey, you need to dig a canal, then you have to go dig a canal. So it was a bit like slavery, like they didn't get paid or nothing. They just had to work there, except they were nobody's property, like they could run away. And they were considered humans, right? It was not like they were like seen as a different animal. They were just at the bottom. So this was the vast majority of people who were serfs. A serf is a bit comparable to your modern becario in the faculty. We have to explain it in a modern metaphor, right? If you have a beca from Conacyt, you probably have to do some work for the faculty, right? So that's a relationship. In order for you to stay, you have to work, and your labor gets drafted by people like me. So that's the idea, right? You draft not money, but labor from people. Now, this society really sucked from the perspective of the serf, which was the absolute majority of people, because they had to listen to so many different people. Susanna, sorry, you have a question.
Yes, I have a question.
You can tell it.
I'm sorry, the Microsoft turned off. Did the king and the nobility have like a power struggle or something? Or did the aristocracy, like the nobility, just follow whatever the king wanted?
No, they would have a lot of power struggles. Although they're on the same team, they're united against the people. They would be backstabbing each other all the time. A bit like in Game of Thrones, if you saw that.
No, no.
Okay, that's okay. It's not that great. Anyway, but yes, they would fight each other a lot. I'm going to talk about that at the end and why they would fight. So, from perspective of the normal person, right? Let's take Susanna. Susanna was a serf who lived on, I don't know, on the farm of Carlos. And Carlos says, Susanna, it's time to get water. So, okay, you go to the well, which is 2 kilometers away, with your bucket of water. Because you have to, because the boss man on whose house you live told you to. And on the way there, you see the king. You're like, oh my God, the king! I finally meet you. The king's like, shut up, woman. Give me that water. Okay, you give the water to the king. You have to walk back to the well. On the way to the well, you come into the baron who owns the local land on which you live. Baron is like, woman, I need you to bring me 3 buckets of water to my castle. You're like, oh my mess. Okay. You take the water, you go to the castle. And then on the way to the castle, you walk into the bishop. And the bishop is like, hey, can you give me water? You're like, dude, I'm bringing water to the baron. Right? Plus, he's higher on rank than you. And then the bishop, or let's say the local monk, he's like, yeah, but didn't the Bible say you have to help the thirsty? Well, I'm thirsty, right? You're like, oh my man, someone give you water. You're like, oh, no, you're gonna go to hell. You're like, I don't want to go to hell. All right. Then you give water to him, and then when you finally get home by Carlos because you were late, right? So the point of the story is you had so many people you had to listen to. Like every other rank in society had authority over you in a very direct sense, like they were your boss. You worked for them, for all of them. And then you had the church also bossing you around. So it was a bit confusing to listen to, especially if they disagreed on things. You had to make some hard choices. Do you listen to the guy who's closest to you, who knows you and you know, in whose house you live? Or do you listen to the king who's kind of far away, but you know, they always told you have to listen to the king, or do you listen to God or whatever? So it was politically, this was not a pleasant situation for 90% of the people. Because politics was so far away and you know, you just dealt with the consequences of politics. You didn't engage in politics. So that, dear students, is feudalism, how it economically and socially worked. Now I'm going to take a little break in my lecture from history. I'm going to talk later about the law and the politics of it. And connect this to the present, right? To keep hopefully your interest a bit. So feudalism. This system ended with the French Revolution in the West, and Japan much later. Ended with the French Revolution. But is it really gone? That's my question, right? Is feudalism really over? Technically, Francisco, I'll take your question after. But remind me. Technically, yes, right? Legally, this got abolished. People were equal before the law today. And we have capitalism, which is based on wage labor, not on system of rent. But in the last 10 years, a lot of things happened that made our economy more feudal, I would say. This is an open thing, right? I'm just sharing my thoughts with you. If you look at which companies have been successful recently, like the big players, right? Like Amazon, Facebook, Google, Uber, etc. One thing they have in common, with the exception of maybe Microsoft, although they still fit in this, is that they don't actually make stuff. Yeah, sure, Amazon shoots some videos of themselves. But the bulk of their business model is not production, right? They're not comparable to Nestle or Unilever, who make stuff and sell it. What these companies really do is they rent stuff for you to make things with, right? They lease platforms of production to others. They don't produce. It's easiest to understand maybe with Uber, right? Uber really does nothing at all. Uber is an app which isn't that complex, right? This is a relatively basic thing technologically. It just combines GPS with some kind of chat system, right? Which they developed years ago. And all they do is lease this to taxi drivers, so taxi drivers could work. So now to work now these days, right, you need to have the Uber thing. And for that, they take between 20 and 40% of the money they earn, right? So if you go to Uber, at least between 1/4 and 1/3 of the money goes to Uber for essentially doing nothing, right? So this is not very different from working on land you lease from someone and then giving them part of the product, except that in the feudal days, you would actually give them less. You would only give them 10%. While in Uber, you give them 25 to 40%, right? So these Uber people, they don't work for Uber, technically, right? In practice, they do, of course, but you can avoid Social Security by not having them as employees. And they just generate money for the lord of Uber. The same with Amazon. Amazon doesn't actually do stuff, right? Okay, they do stuff, but they don't make stuff. They sell someone else's stuff. And if you as a company of anything, clothes, shoes, whatever, if you're a company today, you kind of need to pay taxes to Amazon, right? You need to pay your tribute to use their market space. And they just sit back and let you find clients, and then they earn on that. Same with Airbnb, does nothing at all. It just runs a relatively simple website and just make cash from other people renting their stuff. Same with YouTube from Google. YouTube doesn't do nothing. They just own the space. And then people like you create the content. And you kind of pay a tax to them, right? Well, you don't, but they just take part of your money that you generate. So all of these companies, it's a lease system, right? It technically is like feudalism. In essence, these are commons that are taxed by the companies. Same with Microsoft. Even Microsoft does make things, software, but really what it is that if you want to work, right, you need Office. If I want to write a book, which is a real thing that is sold, right, I'm basically leasing software to write from them, and they just make money of the work of everyone, right? So the point here is that capitalism seems to be moving away from a system of production, at least the big capital, right? The billionaires are all people who rent stuff rather than make stuff. And they have us, the serfs, working for them without working, like we don't have a labor contract, yet they somewhat tax us, yeah. And you'll see that capitalism is moving that direction, that rent becomes much more important than productive forces, which also means that inequality will grow more rapidly, right? Because this is made of just already having things. You don't need to actually do things for it. You don't even need to invest. You just have other people investing and giving you money. So that's where we are heading slowly, the economy, at least in the West. And China is different, but here that's where things are turning. You also, on a much lower level, still have remnants of real feudalism, the agricultural part, in how Mexican agriculture is organized, especially since NAFTA. Since NAFTA, most farms are mega corporations, right? They're big American multinationals that own whole valleys, and they then have their local bosses, let's say their counts, who run it. And these large farmers they're not farmers, as in they never touched a shovel, right? The only time they touch vegetables in the supermarket. They're not actual farmers. You know the guys with the hats and like your typical regular farmer doesn't actually farm, right? The guys driving a pickup truck, they pay people to farm on their land. A friend from Sonora calls them 5-inch farmers. Do you have any idea where this word comes from? 5-inch farmer. No gambles?
No.
The idea is that they drive up in their truck and then they lower the window 5 inches and then they push through the money for the workers. That's their job. That's why it's called 5-inch, because that's all they ever see, is just to lower their window and push out the wage and then zoom, back to the club. So these are the people who own farms, right? They don't actually work. Most people who used to be farmers 50 years ago actually work now for someone else. One day, big rich guy came to town, bought their land, and forever after, your family now works for them, right? Which in practice is very similar to feudalism. It is not feudalism because it doesn't legally work like that. But in terms of how people live and spend their life, it is not that different, right? So I'm trying to show you some parallels. Somebody had a question. I interrupted them. It was a man, I remember.
Oh, it was me, but it was kind of more of a commentary. I thought you were going in a little bit slight direction, like comparing feudalism to modern time. The main characteristic, I think, of the economic organization of feudalism, or at least I've heard Richard Wolff say it was like the relationship between the lord and the serf. And that relationship is still the same between an employer and an employee. And basically he argues the same, that they are like taking the labor and underpaying the worker for it, which is like the example you said from Uber.
Yeah, in that case, right? But your standard capitalist, your standard guy, like Oxel, they do pay them, right? Uber indeed is an example where you actually don't get paid at all. Like it's very one-dimensional. You just give the money and that's it. Here the worker pays the boss. But yeah, capitalism is a bit different. I'm just saying there's still shadows of it. Laura, you have a question?
Yeah, I would like to know if like landlords count as neo-feudalism.
It's a very big landlords to some extent. But it doesn't, nothing, this is not an official thing, right? It's just my idea of it. But like if you own a whole apartment block, it goes in this direction, right? Especially if the people you rent to then sub-rent, then it really becomes a feudal system, right? Because one then pays the other and etc. Susanna.
So it's mostly like the people who gave, like there's actually people that actually live or lease land to domestic workers, so they can live and receive food for their work. And it's kind of like feudalism, but I'm sure they get paid, but like they do receive like land and food for their services, like in actual days.
Yes. Now one big difference, one of the problems of this type of economy is that capitalism is normally based on a contractual relationship, right? Between employer and employee. Part of that contract should be social security. Now, in this type of like people who drive for Uber, since they have no contract or certain domestic employees, like you said, 95% of domestic employees don't have a contract. That includes your parents' cleaning ladies. they don't get Social Security. Therefore, when they retire, they have nothing. But let's talk about it a bit more, right? So this is economically. Now let's talk about socially. Again, the question is feudalism socially over? Technically, yes, because we're equal before the law. Yes. There is no such thing as an official aristocracy and an official serving class. Yet, in practice, you still have remnants of this. You have something called the mafia de poder. I know you link that word to the president, but as a sociologist, I find this word, regardless of the politics of it, a very useful word. I think this actually really exists, right? And you know it exists. You know that Mexico, in practice, besides whoever is president, doesn't matter if it's Peña Nieto or AMLO, on a local level in which we all live, things are run by a local elite, by a network of elites that share power. Judges, empresarios, director, they all know each other. They all meet each other in the weekend at the golf club, right? At the men's club or the strip club, wherever, at some club. They know each other, they marry each other's daughters, and they help each other, right? Let me ask you a question. Which one of you has faith in judges? Let's say that you have a sister and that sister gets sexually assaulted by the CEO of Oxo, and she tries to sue them, and this goes to your old school San Pedro judge. Let me say negatively, which one of you does not have faith that you will get a fair trial? Can you raise your hand?
Can you repeat that, please?
The question is, if your sister would get assaulted by one of the richest people in Mexico, which one of you believes that the judge will be fair? Which one of you doesn't believe that the judge will be fair? Okay, I see a lot of hands. I think we're going 50-50. No, we're going over half. 31, 32, 33. Okay. I see that a lot of people don't have faith in judges, right? Now, there must be a reason for this, right? It's not random that you don't trust the judge. It's because you know the mafia de poder is a real thing, right? You know that they do know each other and that elites will support each other to the point that they're able to bend the law. And that's a very real thing in your lives. Like if you would have a professor who would harass you, for example, which I'm being recorded, right? Okay, I won't go into much detail about who that could be, but it comes down not to a question of justice, but to who knows most people, right? In practice. So different groups do still have different laws. They don't have different laws, but that law in practice needs to be applied by a judge. So you still have legal inequality in practice. At least you believe that. Most of you believe that. So in that sense, feudalism still works, right? Then the next question is, okay, but these groups, right? These classes, let's call them, at least they're flexible, right? It's not by birth that you inherit this right. You're not mafia de poder by birth. Well, this works a little bit different than most people think. To give some background, I'm a sociologist, right, of social problems. I study inequality and poverty. Let me tell you something. Social class in Mexico is a very stable phenomenon, much more stable than people think it is. So in a recent study of last year, it showed that in 2017, right, if you divide society in 5, so you get quintiles, 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, 100%, in which 100% are the richest and 1% is the poorest person, right? of the 5th quintile, so of the top 20, of which many of you are part, only 3% of the top 20 wasn't born in the top 20. So, and these are not the rich people, right? This is just middle class and up. Of those, only 3% of people, their parents, were from a lower quintile. Now, of those 3% newcomers, only 6% actually come from poverty. So these are the first 2 quintiles, right? The bottom 40%. Only 6% of the 3% of people who became middle class actually come from the low end of the spectrum. Most of them come from the 4th quintile, right? Lower middle class to higher middle class. So 0.1% of people in upper middle class come from the bottom. Well, not even the bottom, right? The bottom 40%. That's your chance of leaving poverty in Mexico. Just to understand that you understand what I'm saying, right? You say it's hard to leave poverty. This is your percentage you have. You have 0.18% chance to leave poverty, statistically speaking. This is the facts as they are. And then you're not even rich, right? You're just on a level that you would go to university. Rich is much lower chance. It's the top 1%. So, yeah, you're not born into a class in theory. In practice, though, it's a very certain bet that you're going to be in your case for the rest of your life. Yeah. So these few classes, in practice, there's still a lot of that remaining. That was my point here. Just something to think about, right? All right, now let's move back to history. Let's jump back in our time machine, shift gear. We go back to the Middle Ages, right? When all of this started. How did the law work? You're all very silent, I hope. You're thinking about what I just said. How did the law work in that time? So it depends a bit on the time zone, right? You first had the Roman law, we talked about that earlier. But then as Rome fell apart, basically for the next 300, 400 years, it was very tribal societies of wild men like us. And at that time, the law was more or less tied to the tribe. The law would just be the rules of a group. Just like different cartels, drug cartels have their own legal system. Different tribes have their own legal system, but it belonged to them. It came with the people, right? If that tribe moved, they brought their rules with them. It was not bound to any territory. Now that doesn't really work in later context when you have cities and when you're not moving, right? Because then what if someone from the outside comes live there? They're not part of that people, so they live outside the law. This only works in a very primitive state. Ever after and before, law is based on territory, right? There's the laws of the land. Depends where you are. And that was based on custom. So it was just the habits of the people who lived there. And the people means the rich. The habits of the elite. Rich is not the right word because they didn't necessarily have much money. They just had land or power. Of the elite. They would have certain customs, certain way of doing things that they've always been doing. And that is what the law would be more or less based on. The problem here is that you had a lot of these territories, right? Because the king split it into 5 and the duke split into 5 again. And, then you have 25 different little territories, which all had different laws, right? So if you would move from one to the other, you're just in a different country, and that could just be 1 kilometer away, right? So for example, for merchants, this was very confusing. because you had different trade laws in every village, almost. Not every village, but like every realm, every city. So law was a very confusing thing. And again, law was unequal. So you had different laws then for different people in different places. And this was all based on customs. It was all based on the idea that this is just how we do it, right? It's the law because that's how it is. It's just because it was. In such a system, and this is how it practically worked, right? Not how it theoretically worked, like we saw with Thomas of Aquinas and God's laws and natural law and all this stuff. In practice, it was based on custom, and that means that laws changes very slowly, because it only changes when the custom changes. I'm not going to go too deep into this. In international law in 5th semester, we're going to come back to customary law and how that works. I'm just going to go over this a bit faster here. But in theory, it means that if the king wants to make or apply a law, he doesn't invent the law, he finds it, right? He interprets the customs that exist in a way that supports his judgment. So you don't create whole new things. You always need to base it on something of the past, right? Or kill everyone. Like the king could force things, but not without struggle. Normally, he just has to work within the system of privileges and rights that already exists, and he cannot really mess with it. So in a very abstract way, since the king works within the customs of the elite, in a very abstract way, you could say that he rules by consent, because he rules according to the customs, and he himself is part of that custom, right? There's the tradition of having a king, and since the tradition comes from the people, you could, in a way, justify that he rules with the consent of the people. At least he rules according to how the people are used to being ruled, right? Consent is not anywhere near the modern sense of that word, but that would be the justification politically. Let's talk a bit more about this king. Who is the king, right? We all have the idea of a king. But politically speaking, what's specific about the king? So the king is a person, usually a man, but not always, you could also have a queen, who symbolically combines two types of powers. They have political power. We already saw that theory, by God's will, right? God wanted them to be the leader, wanted them to be on top. Therefore, they are the political ruler. But they also economically are the final authority, because they, on paper at least, technically own all the land. They don't like control all the land, but they own it. And thus all land that exists at the end of the day belongs to the king. Yeah. Now that is at the end of the day, and that's on paper. In practice, the king didn't control all this land. His men controlled all that land, and he controlled the men. But he didn't have the same power as a modern president does, for example. Although he owns everything, he didn't have that type of muscle. What he did really control was the land directly around his castle, like his own province, right? Because his army could directly go there. But things further away, he only owned by proxy. Like he controlled them through other people who controlled that part. So his power was not local. Like if you were a peasant, you should worry more about your local baron than about the king, because he's the one who's going to smash your head, not the king, right? The king doesn't know you exist even. So the king's power was quite abstract in a way, right? Now, how do you become a king? It is a little bit more complex than it might seem on first sight. First of all, you need to qualify for being a king, right? So one way of doing that, one way of ordering that, is via bloodline. So you must be family of the king. Preferably, if you're the firstborn son of the king, you have a very good argument of being the next king. You're not automatically the next king. Maybe you're retarded, right? And it's like, nah, let's skip on this dude. Let's take his little sister. But you have a strong argument if you're the son of the king, or any son of the king, right? Maybe you're the second son, then you murder your brother and you become king, very common. Or at least if this king had no kids, because he was impotent or something, then he had to be one of his closest nobility, right? You could never become king if you were not a noble. So you had to be, at the bare minimum, you had to be a knight to even be considered. But to actually become the king was often a political decision. In some countries, it was just birthright. And no matter who it is, even if the son is a complete idiot of the king and he's 12 years old, okay, that is going to be the next king, right? But in many kingdoms, there were politics involved. So you'd have some sort of election, like the nobility would then choose between the family of the king, right? All his cousins, who's going to be the next king. So it was nothing like a democracy, but the elite would more or less influence who the king would be, or they would have to fight for it, or you had some other system. But there were more ways than just being the firstborn child of a king to become the king. If you were really powerful count, you could make a power play and just try to kill the children of the king after he died, and you become then the next one. So Game of Thrones was not that far off. Or another movie that is interesting in this regard is Black Panther. You remember in Black Panther, the Black Panther is the son of the king, right, of Wakanda. But he doesn't just become king by being the son of the king. He needs to fight other candidates in this waterfall thing, right? So there's multiple roads or multiple ways of electing the new king. They just had to be family of the king And since they all married each other in the elite, it was not that hard to be family of the king, because you all slept with each other's sisters, with Regio. So that's how it worked. But behind all of this, there was always some idea that God wanted this, right? If they fought, then God, blessed the victor. If it was the son of the king, then God chose the baby. Or even if they got elected, they would then, and this was all theater, right? They would say that they were inspired by God in this moment. And they would be like, oh, it should be Jeffrey. Yes, because they're acting for the peasants to believe this. But they would somehow always justify that it's God's will, even if it was an election. And it goes for the king, and it goes the same for the emperor and the pope. The emperor, sometimes, if there was an emperor, would also be elected amongst kings, then who would be the emperor, if they had no direct son of mature age. And the Pope was also elected. The Pope was actually the most elected of these people, right? The Pope, still today, the bishops gather in Rome, and then they meditate, and then God tells them who the next Pope will be, and then they vote. That's how it really works. And then the next person becomes a Pope. Miss Susanna, I always say it wrong. Sorry.
I'm sorry. If the king committed like a great sin, could he be like replaced or killed away from the throne?
Not legally, but they could just kill him. I mean, these were not times where people were very concerned with moral behavior. So especially at the top, right? The peasants, they were all scared of Satan and trying to live a good life, but people at the top, not. So if a king was making like massive mistakes, like fighting wars with more powerful kings or bringing doom upon the land, often they would just kill him one day. Like the people right below him would just do some kind of conspiracy. So that could happen, but in most places there was no mechanism for dethroning a king. Only if you were part of the empire, then the emperor could dethrone a king, right? But otherwise, no. There's no real mechanism. But that doesn't mean that it wouldn't happen. Or sometimes the people would just rise up. Very rarely they would do that, but it could happen that the king would get killed. But there was no legal way of doing this in most cases.
Thank you.
It all depends on local laws, right? How serious they were about the succession. If you live in a very serious place, then and let's say the king died and his oldest son was 9, you were just screwed because you then had a child as your king, and whatever he said you had to do, and it was all misery. But some places took that less serious, and they would just say, "Nah, we need the duke will be the next king or whatever until the other guy is 18." They would find a way of solving. It was all very practical politics. So let's talk a bit about the politics of it now. So how would the king rule, right? First of all, one thing I didn't explain yet is that the king was also the judge. So there was no separation of powers, right? But in fact, one of the main things the king would do, most of his time he would spend, well, on eating, but besides that, most of his service time, he would spend judging. He would sit on his throne and people would come to him. He would have like open door day, and people would come to him, complain about something, and he would then judge that. Like, she stole my chickens. Well, then kill him, or something like that. So he spent a lot of time ruling the law, and there's his rule. You must understand rule in a kind of judge way, right? He had to rule within the laws that already existed before him. Kings could not radically change things. They could order people around, and there was absolute command. If the king said jump, you had to jump. But he couldn't change the structure of things. Well, he could, but then you would get into a war, etc. He normally wasn't expected to change the rules. He had to kind of keep this balance of power. He had to respect the privileges of the church, the privileges of the big farmers. He had to just politic it. A bit like how a mayor operates these days, right? A mayor spends a lot of time just managing local elite and then balancing their interests. And listening to the people. But the people here, and you should by now be very suspicious of what the word people means, right? Remember the Greek times. By people, he really means the aristocracy, right? Those were the people he would talk to and listen to. And then the aristocracy, the nobles, the knights, they represent the people in the sense that the people live on their land and they represent that land. So, like, their part of the country is represented, but they didn't choose the knight, right? Or the duke. So that's how it worked in the sense of representation. That's the space the king had. Now, as somebody asked earlier, yes, there was a power struggle between the king and the nobles, usually. Because the king, on the one hand, the king is on top, right? That's why he's the king. He theoretically owns all the land, and he is stronger than any single person below him. As in, he has the biggest castle, he probably has more troops than any of them, because his army is made out of all their troops, right? Remember, that's the system. He gives them land, they give him troops. So his army is made of a combination of all the troops of the people below him. So that army is bigger than any part of it, right? So the king is the strongest, but as a group, the people below him are stronger than him. If all counts would unite, they probably are stronger than the king because the king's army is made of their people, right? So if they stop giving him troops, and then he's going to run out of them quite fast, right? Because he doesn't have the manpower to. So the king, he can single out one of the people below him and crush them, but he cannot crush them all at the same time. So they kind of keep each other hostage in some way. And they constantly, the single noble, he can't piss off the king too much, but the king can't piss them off too much either. That would be the system. internally. Outside, they're all fighting each other too, and all kings are fighting each other and all this madness. But inside, that's how it would work. So in practice, politics meant negotiation between elites. Politics was super high level at that point. Politics, like nobody listened to the people. Nobody even cared at all about what people thought or wanted, right? It was all at the top. It was all backroom politics. It was what you would call court politics, because the politics that took physically place at the royal court, at the king's palace, right? In those halls, that's where things were decided. And that's where people would get assassinated, and that's where all the drama happens. So you'd have the king sitting in a room, and then around him, to his left and his right, you have a bunch of other people, and they kind of argue with each other all the time, and that's how you must physically imagine it. So politics really was power struggle, and you will understand next class, which is about Machiavelli, much better in that regard, right? Things are not about the people, it's about your high-level power struggle. Which is sad, because nobody was thinking about things like, what about the poor? How if we provide healthcare? Or what about education? These were not questions that were being discussed. The question that was being discussed is, how can we take Geoffrey's land, right, without the others rebelling? This were more what politics was about. Now, spoiler, what's going to happen? Long term, like over 1,000 years, the king is going to win this power struggle. I'm going to explain that next week, how he did that. But the king will win this fight, in Europe at least. So things will become centralized, and the nobles at some point are going to disappear. But not for long, because not that long after, you get the same situations, but with capitalists. So then the biggest business elite would just be with the king, and then they would do the kind of same thing over and over again. So history changes and repeats itself at the same time. Do you have questions about feudalism? Or things you want to say? No, you don't? Good. Oh, Miss Juno. Du har pronounced good.
Yes, I have a question about the king. You said that he has like an abstract power. I was wondering if that's why the church kind of had like more influence in the people, because they showed that power more actively, like saying about the eternal salvation and all that stuff. While the king, well, he also showed the power, like they can kill the people, but it was not as actively shown, I guess. I was wondering if that was why.
Well, for a number of reasons, and you're close, right? I think, I'm not a super expert on Middle Ages, but first of all, the king wasn't there, right? The king is in his castle. Most people would never see the king. They only saw their local baron or knight. So the king is quite far away, while the priest is in every village, right? They would know their priest. They would know the church. The church was a physical building in the center of their town. The church was more concrete in that sense than the king was. You would maybe once in your life travel to the capital and see the king's castle or something. So the church was physically more present, and the church was united. So Europe was split. You must imagine there's like 600 different little counties and kings, and like you had a few big ones like the King of France, but a lot of hundreds of different little provinces, etc. But the church was the church. It was the same everywhere, right? It was the Roman Catholic Church. So they were the only, let's say, universal institution in that time. They were the only institution that was everywhere. So they had better information because they knew what was going on. They knew all the kings, right? The Pope did. So that gave them politically a big diplomatic advantage, let's say. So that meant that the church was powerful, at least at the beginning. Throughout time, so the church, Christ was born, Christ dies, his people move to Rome, they suffer for a few hundred years, then around the year 100, 200, they get to power, Rome becomes Catholic, Roman Empire spreads religion, and so they're on the way up, and then let's say around the year 1200 they peak, and then slowly their power will start going down. I'll talk about that maybe next week somewhere, about why their power went down. But at some point, yeah, the church peaked in power. Is that a good answer, Miss?
Yes, thank you.
All right. If no one else has a question, then I have a question for you. Who is this? Any ideas who the hell this guy is? It's not my father. No guesses.
I feel like he's someone with a lot of money, but I have no idea who he is.
Yeah, somewhat. This man, dear students, this man is my king. Not in a romantic sense, in a literal sense. He is my king and I am his subject. This is Philip I of Belgium. Unlike you, I actually come from a kingdom. I come from the Kingdom of Belgium, and this is my king. I've never met him, he's never met me, but we are in some political serf royal lord relationship. So Philip, right? But he's a very different king than the kings we talked about, right? He has much less power than these kings. He is not actually the leader. And I don't remember him asking me to do any work for him. But he's my king nonetheless. So what I want to do is talk a bit about kings. Oh, by the way, he's also a soldier. He can fly F-16. He's a jet fighter pilot. I want to talk a bit with you in the coming weeks about contemporary kings, right? How kings still exist. They just work or function a bit different depending on where you are in the world. So this has to do with your next homework. What that is going to be, and I'll upload the instructions and the themes for this right afterwards in the next hour, is that we're going to do group presentations. We're going to spend a week on this because you have to present. I cannot get around this. This is what we're going to do. What we're going to do is we're going to do presentation on contemporary monarchies. So you're going to get assigned a kingdom or an empire or a sultanate that exists today. And you, in max 10 minutes, are going to present on how that kingdom is ruled today. How does it work? So there's some questions you must cover in your presentation. You must say who is the king or queen in some cases. So who is the current monarch? Or maybe the multiple. And how old is this bloodline, right? That they got installed 10 years ago, or have these people been ruling that country for 500 years? Then I want to know, and you can put a picture of them, right? Like I showed you, our king. Then you have to tell me, how can you become the king, right? Can you become the king or queen in most cases? Can you become queen or not? How? Can women become queen, etc.? Then I want to know what are the powers of this monarch. what can he actually do, right? Is he or she actually the boss of that country, and how are they limited? For example, in my case, I just told you that Philip I, although he's a good king, he has not a lot of power at all. But that's different in some countries. In Saudi Arabia, the king has a lot of power, right? So I want you to tell us about that. And also, has this radically changed in the last 30 years? Like, did they used to have a lot of power, and then in the year 2000 they stripped that away from him? Or maybe there was no king and they invented a king in the last 30 years, right? Maybe it was a former communist country where they killed the king and then they found some cousin of him to become king again. That's what I want you to talk about, right? Presentations, I made the teams already. They're random. They're according to alphabet. Not everybody needs to present because you're going to have teams of 5. Not because that's great, but because there's not enough kings in the world to make smaller teams. That's the reason. It's too many of you. Not everybody needs to talk. 2 people per team can talk. I do want to see you when you talk. So you can do a lottery internally of who that's going to be. You just divide the tasks within your team. Say, okay, you answer this question, this and that. And then you push forward to presentable man or woman to present this in 10 minutes. So that's what we're going to be filling the next weeks with. Starting next Tuesday. So next Tuesday we will start with this, and then I made a plan of who speaks when, but I already know that plan is going to fail, so we're just going to keep going till everybody's done, right? So that's your next homework. What do you think?
Great.
To answer your question, Philip is not a poor man, but he's not rich like the Queen of England is rich. Like, he's a millionaire, but he's not a billionaire. Any other questions about this course, about politics, national politics, about global politics?
Doctor, where can we find the list of the teams? And
you can find it. Yes.
And the Sign Kingdom, you put the kingdom right to next to our names, right? I guess.
Yes. You can find it in 20 minutes on Teams. It's on a different laptop. I cannot upload it now, but I will very soon do that. Any other questions about life, politics, feudalism? All right.
Does these contemporary monarchies are gonna fall like in medium or long term?
Well, they haven't fallen in a lot of time, so that's in their advantage. I don't know. What's surprising is that some monarchies are new. Spain, for example, used to not have a king, and then they kind of brought a king back, which was a weird move. Okay, logically, they should disappear in the long term. If you would start a new country, right, you probably would not start it with a king. You probably would have a president. So I think on the very long term, let's say 500 years from now, I don't think there'll be many kings left, no. One advantage of having a king, which is surprising maybe, a king is cheaper than a president. Because you don't need to pay the king's house because he already has it, right? The palace is built, and they already have money. So maintaining a king you know, in terms of security, and often it's often cheaper than maintaining a politically elected person that comes from the bottom. But I think that's one of the only advantages to having a king. So I think that long term, really long term, this should fall. But in the next 100 years, I don't know. They're quite good at surviving. What do you think? Diego, what
I don't
do
know.
you
I
think?
mean, I don't find them useful. So, well, I mean, who can like take them out? Nobody. Or
Well, Parliament, that depends how much power they already have. If they don't have a lot of, in Belgium, if we would decide next year, and we, like, if 80% of people decide to get rid of the king, they could. This is not that hard to do that. They just need to come to that point. But in a country like Saudi Arabia, you will die before you'll be able to do that if you're an individual. Miss Susanna, you had a question, or did I see that wrong?
Oh, yes, I have a question. Is it possible that we make our teams, please?
No,
Oh, okay, thank you.
because you won't do it in time. And randomness is sometimes good for you. Right? This is not a hard homework, by the way. This is very simple. These answers are very literal answers. They're not particularly hard to find, and it doesn't last very long. This is kind of a filler homework. Like, I just want you to do this. If you just tell me these things, then you pass easily. All right. Then, dear students, I'm not going to keep you any longer. If you have no more questions or poetry you want to recite or songs to sing. Oh,
Sorry. Do the monarchies today have a positive, have more of a positive or negative effect, or they're just neutral, just hanging there? Like,
what do you
are
mean with
there
effect?
keeping monarchies is positive or it just negative, or it doesn't matter if they are or
Well,
if
that
they're not?
depends on the country. As I said, I would not invent a king. A king is, there's something basically idiotic about having a king, right? The idea that just because they're the son of some guy who 100 years ago did something, and in case of Belgium, wasn't particularly good, the old kings, that doesn't, you know, there's something just stupid about it. So I'm not going to make it, well, I think I'm against kings if I have to make a choice, but sometimes they do good. Like, for example, in Belgium, the king right now is very important because one of the few powers he has is that he can appoint who has to make a government. So, okay, let me compare this to Mexico. Let's say next elections, right? Let's say in Nuevo León, next elections, probably it's going to be a four-way split. So Morena 25%, PRI 25%, PAN 25%, Movimiento 25%. So I have to form a coalition, right? Of two of them. In Belgium, the king would decide who can try first, like who can have the initiative to invite others to form a coalition. Now, normally that doesn't matter, but in Belgium right now, we have a massive crisis of government for 2 years that we don't have a government. So we one day had elections, then you had like 10 different parties, and they could not agree to form a team. So we didn't have a new government. We just had the old government, but without a majority. So you need to do this game of trying to match them, and the king has the authority to do that. So if it wasn't for the king, it would be a lot of more chaos now, because you would have no neutral figure that's not part of a political party to organize that. I know that's Belgian politics, a bit complex, and if you get what I'm saying. So, but sometimes having like a guy of power who doesn't belong to any side is useful. but in general, it doesn't match with equality well. This whole idea of a king. So I would tend slightly towards negative, although I recognize there are positive sides to it. But personally, I don't care. I don't care if we have the king or not. I'm neutral towards my own king. He's okay because he's okay. If the next person is an idiot, I'll be against the kingdom. But he's not an idiot, so I'm okay with him existing. I'm not going to save him though, if the revolution ever comes. But I'm all right with him being there. Anything else?
Thanks.
Or is that it? If that's it, I'm going to let you girls and guys go, and I'll see you Thursday. See you then.
Have a
Thank you,
nice
Doctor.
day.
Bye.
Thank you, teacher.
Thank you,
Have a nice
teacher.
day.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you.